So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we're going to be talking about a super important case that I have wanted to cover for quite a while now. Today we're going to be talking about the case of Matthew Shepard. Matthew and his murder completely changed America. This is the case that finally got homophobia and crimes against people due to their gender identity, things like that, finally recognised as hate crimes. So I thought this was a super important case for us to have a look at on my channel. This is going to be a two-parter, obviously, because this is such a massive case. Any case that changes the world so much is going to have a lot that we need to cover. So this is part one. Part two will be out in the next few days. Make sure you subscribed with notifications on for my channel so that you don't miss when that one is uploaded. But before we get into it, I just want to thank our sponsors for making this video possible, Playrix, and their free-to-play puzzle game, Homescapes. You can download Homescapes using the link down below in the description, or you can scan this QR code on screen to take you right there. In Homescapes, you're tasked with exploring and renovating this big, creepy, abandoned mansion. You've got to fix it up and bring it back to its full potential. And the storylines that run alongside the puzzle games and the renovations are so good as well. Like, I'm so caught up in these characters' lives. For example, Austin the butler and his childhood friend Catherine seem to have a little bit of something going on. So I'm excited to wrap up this video so I can go and play it and find out what happens. I especially love Homescapes because I'm one of those people, I was not programmed to be able to relax. I always want to feel productive and like I'm doing something. And so a lightly challenging game like Homescapes is perfect for me to feel like I'm working my brain and giving my brain kind of a challenge, but I'm also relaxing and I'm taking some time away from work. It's also just super satisfying fixing up this house from scratch. It really makes me feel like I've achieved something. I really like watching my dream house come together. Remember, the link to download Homescapes is down below in the description, or you can scan this handy dandy QR code on screen right now if you're lazy. I dare you to try and make your mansion nicer than mine. I don't think you'll be able to do it, but I dare you to try. Thanks again to Playrix for sponsoring this video with their free-to-play puzzle game, Homescapes. Now, before we get into the case, I do just want to give my usual disclaimer that I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This video is for educational purposes, and everything that I'm about to say is just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. There are quite a lot of content warnings before we get into this video. Please listen carefully because I don't want anything to trip you up as you're watching this video. There are a lot of different really dark aspects to this case. So if any of the following are things that you don't think you want to hear about right now, then please do click out of this video. Your mental health and your well-being are the most important thing here. I'm sure I'll see you again at some other point with a case that's a little bit more suitable for you, but the themes for this case are as follows: sexual assault, rape, torture, homophobia, depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, general struggles with declining mental health, and body shaming. Like I said, please click out now if any of that is something that you don't feel like you can watch. That being said, let's get straight into the case. So this one takes place in the state of Wyoming in the USA. I don't think I've ever done a case from Wyoming before, specifically a city named Casper. And this is where Matthew Wayne Shepard was born on December 1st, 1976. His parents' names were Judy and Dennis Shepard, and 5 years after the birth of their son Matthew, they welcomed another son named Logan. Dennis and Judy were just absolutely over the moon to be building their little family. Matthew and Logan were the most perfect little boys they could have asked for. This had just been a huge goal in their lives for so long. This was always what they were working towards, was like a happy family unit, as it is for many people on this earth. That's kind of what we all want, really, isn't it? And they finally had that, and they were so happy. Matthew Shepard was known by everyone for his kind and caring nature. In fact, I have a quote from his grandmother who described him as the most empathetic child she'd ever met. An example of this was when Matthew was still very young, he spent his free time writing a different poem to each house on his street, and then he spent the rest of the evening hand delivering these poems that he'd written for each individual house. He was just so sweet and so thoughtful, and he just wanted to put a smile on people's faces. Matthew and Logan both attended the same public school there in Casper, and they got on there pretty well. I mean, they made friends and they got on with the teachers very well. In fact, Matthew's teachers described him as energetic, smart, and soft-spoken. He was willing to be anybody and everybody's friend, and he was just really easy to get along with. It was hard to dislike Matthew Shepard. Everyone said it. But there were always kids that were gonna find a way. And there were kids that were jealous of Matthew in school. They were jealous that he was so popular and so well liked and so easy to get along with, because they weren't. They were the mean kids. They were the horrible kids. And so they picked on him. They found anything to pick on him for. One of the main things that they would bully Matthew for was his physical appearance, mainly his body, because he was quite a generally small boy. All his life, even into adulthood, he never grew past 5'2". And he was barely 100 pounds as well, which is about just over 7 stone. So this is a very physically small boy, and the other boys would pick on him for it. And because his body never changed, and these kids, these horrible kids, never changed, this bullying continued literally for as long as Matthew knew them, for as long as he lived there in Casper. But when Matthew was 17 years old, his father Dennis would be given a life-changing promotion because he worked in the oil engineering industry, and in 1994 his bosses asked him if he would be willing to move out to Saudi Arabia to work on a bigger plant. And the increase in pay, I mean, it was just a no-brainer. Of course the family were going to pick up and move to Saudi Arabia, and that's exactly what they did. They settled in the Saudi Aramco residential camp in Durham, and this was a special community literally built by, I think, the place that his father worked for their workers. It was like a little village that was put together specifically for the workers there. And so it was a very safe, very trusted place to live. But there was one issue, and that was there were absolutely no English-speaking schools within a reachable radius of where the boys now lived, Matthew and Logan, which was an issue because they only spoke English. They couldn't just join any of the schools around because they would be so lost. So the only other option here really was for the boys to go away for boarding school. They were sent to the American school in Switzerland, which is a very prestigious school, actually. And Matthew and Logan fit in so well here. I mean, this school gave them so many more opportunities than they'd ever had at any of their other schools. There were subjects on offer that they hadn't had access to before, like German, Italian, theatre studies, and it was theatre studies that Matthew found a real passion in. And he was really good at it too. He was very, very talented. He particularly excelled in music and fashion design as well. While he was here at this new school, of course, due to his kind, caring, nurturing qualities, he wanted to help his fellow students, and so he actually volunteered to become a peer counsellor. And that's essentially just where if students are struggling and they just need a friend or they need a shoulder to cry on, someone to unload to, they would go to Matthew, tell him all of their problems, and he would try to give them some peer advice, you know, friend-to-friend advice. And he did that just out of the good of his heart in his free time, because he wanted to. That's the kind of boy that this was. And it was actually here, while he was at this boarding school, the American school, that Matthew Shepard realised that he was gay. This was something that he'd thought about quite a lot through his life, but he never fully consolidated it in his brain until this moment in high school. Although he decided that he was actually going to keep that information to himself for a little while longer. He didn't tell anyone. In February of 1996, this was Matthew's senior year at school, and him and a group of his friends decided to go on holiday to Marrakesh in Morocco, just as kind of like a end of year celebration, I suppose. Matthew is about 19 years old at this point. But this trip that was supposed to be a celebration of the end of the year, it was supposed to be a great time, this trip actually turned out to be one of the most traumatic things that ever happened to Matthew Shepard. Because it was here in Marrakesh that Matthew would be walking home alone one evening when he was jumped by a group of local men and brutally assaulted. Matthew and all of his friends had been out during the day, and then in the evening they all went back to the apartment or the hotel, wherever they were staying, and they all went to bed. But Matthew wasn't tired, and he decided to make the most of Marrakesh while he was there, so he left the apartment and went to a coffee shop. He hung out there for a while until eventually he decided to go back home and try going to bed again. So he set off walking from this coffee shop to his apartment, and that was when he was approached by these men. In a completely unprovoked surprise attack, these men beat Matthew Shepard and stole absolutely everything he had on him. But the attack didn't even stop there. Each of these men then took turns gang raping Matthew Shepard. There were 6 of them in total, so this was a very prolonged ordeal. When they were done, all the men simply ran off and left Matthew collapsed, bloody, injured and traumatised on the side of the road in Marrakesh, a place that he didn't even know. Matthew, of course, went to Marrakesh police about this incident and they looked into it for him, but they just couldn't find any suspects. And eventually this case went cold. Matthew Shepard's rapists got away with it. And this event completely changed Matthew afterwards, as I'm sure it would anyone. This is such a traumatic thing to go through. He became withdrawn, he was distrusting, he was anxious all the time. The usual outgoing, funny, bubbly, fun-loving Matthew was gone, and what was left was a shell of the boy that he once was. Matthew struggled so badly with flashbacks and nightmares following this ordeal, to the point where he couldn't even really be alone a lot of the time, because that was when he would get these flashbacks and they were so traumatic. His paranoia really would just eat away at him, and slowly but surely his life became not even a life anymore. He wasn't even doing anything anymore because he couldn't push himself to leave the house. Matthew started to binge drink occasionally. He took drugs to be able to try and cope with these feelings that he had now. He tried to just numb and suppress all of this. And his mental health only just continued to decline as time went by. It wasn't getting better, it was getting worse. His anxiety was becoming unbearable. He would have panic attacks every single day. And it eventually came to the point where Matthew Shepard became suicidal. He no longer wanted to live with these feelings and with these thoughts and with these limits now put on his life because he was too scared to do anything. He isolated himself from the whole world and just slipped into a more and more severe depression as days went by, until eventually he decided to seek out the help of a therapist. And this helped slightly. His anxiety became easier to deal with. He was slightly less depressed. Of course, he was still dealing with what happened to him. It didn't change the events that he'd been through. And so he still struggled with a lot of things, quite severely still, but it just got a tiny bit better. It was a little bit more manageable. But these mental health issues, the anxiety, the depression, they would never fully go away. And they followed Matthew Shepard for the rest of his life, into his late teenage years, into his adulthood. Eventually, Matthew graduated from his school over in Switzerland and he moved back to the United States, but not back to Wyoming. Not just yet. Like I said earlier, Matthew was so in love with musical theatre. That theatre class that he took in high school really opened up all these passions for him, and he realised that was what he wanted to do with his life. And so he decided to enroll in Catawba College, which is in North Carolina, and it specialised in the arts, so this was perfect for him. And not only because of those reasons, it was perfect for so many reasons. It was quite a small college as well, and of course Matthew was still struggling with his anxiety and stuff like that, so a smaller college with less people, less crowds, less noise, it was going to be easier for him to deal with, of course. And it also just had a great reputation within the industry. People that graduated from Catawba went on to do great things, and so Matthew really had high hopes for his careers. But after a few months studying at Catawba College, Matthew decided that this wasn't really for him. I don't know exactly what it was, I don't know what the thought process behind this was, but he wanted to leave. It wasn't how he saw his life going anymore. He decided to move back to Wyoming and do his schooling there instead, and he enrolled in Casper Community College. I think this was just kind of a placeholder because he didn't really know what he wanted to do right now. He just realised that musical theatre wasn't for him, so he was just enrolling in here until he kind of realised what his true calling was. But now that he was back in Wyoming, Matthew Shepard actually had something that he wanted to tell his mother and his father, and that was that he was gay. He was finally coming out to them. When he told his mother, she simply turned round to him and said, "I've known you were gay for years." She was proud of her son for finally opening up to her. I think at this point maybe he was about 20 years old. She loved and accepted her son for who he was, although his friends did say that it was a little bit more of a gradual process to get them kind of understanding and educated on the whole topic. I think it was more his father than it was his mother. His father must have just had that kind of upbringing where they've got prejudices and things like that. Not against his own son. Don't get me wrong, his father was not homophobic or hateful to Matthew in any way. They had good intentions and they did love and accept Matthew, but there were quite a lot of conversations that needed to be had. Matthew kind of had to tell his parents why they couldn't say or do certain things, you know, but they were willing to learn. They were willing to do whatever it took to make their son feel comfortable in their presence, and they did. They took on all of his advice and information on board, they educated themselves, and they were the best parents that they could have been in that situation, I think. I wish I could give you more of an example to explain what I mean by all of that, you know, where they had to have conversations and stuff, but I don't have any examples. I'm sure you can kind of guess what kind of things were said. But I think the reason that Matthew finally built up this courage to be able to share this part of himself with his parents was because he'd actually made his very first openly gay friend at college. This friend was named Romaine Peterson, and she had been openly lesbian for years at this point. She was open with everyone that she met about it. She never hid or covered that part of herself. And Matthew had never seen this before because this was his first ever gay friend. He'd never seen someone be so proudly and openly themselves. And this was so inspiring for Matthew that just her being that way, just her being herself, gave him the courage to be himself. Romaine was Matthew's first friend that really understood him. She really understood his struggles and what it was like to be him. They got each other on a deeper level. They were great friends. Romaine was a great listener for Matthew as well. This was the first time that he felt able to tell one person absolutely everything about his life, from his trauma back in Marrakesh to him being closeted for years. He told Romaine everything. And the two of them actually grew so close, they were best friends, and they decided to move in together. They found this perfect apartment in Denver, Colorado. The two of them moved there. They picked up multiple jobs each to be able to afford to live over there. It was kind of like a bit of a gap year kind of moment for Matthew, I suppose. He was just living with a friend, enjoying life, and then he was going to continue his studies a little bit later on. And it seemed that Matthew just loved it in Denver. He really found himself there, because back at home in Casper, they just didn't quite have an LGBT scene. People weren't quite as fully as accepting as they were in Denver. His hometown was just very sheltered and somewhat toxic to a degree, and so now that he was in Denver, he was learning new things, meeting new people, stuff that he wouldn't have experienced if he was still at home. And one of the things that Matthew discovered about himself at this point in time was that his passion wasn't really in musical theatre like he thought it was at one point. He found that his passion was just in helping others. At this point, he had part-time jobs, I think, in the service industry, and it just made him really happy. Every time he would serve a customer, he would see the smile on their face, they would say thank you to him, and he would feel like he'd made a difference in that person's day, and he really liked that. Even though that was just on a small scale, he didn't want to just work in service for the rest of his life. But that gave him a taste of what he could do on a larger scale. If he can make just a customer happy for 2 minutes, then what can he do if he really dedicated his life to helping others? Matthew was incredibly passionate about equality and social justice. Being a gay man himself, he understood what it felt like to be unfairly treated, and he wanted to make some big changes in the world. And with these big changes and big ideas in mind, Matthew Shepard moved back to Wyoming, specifically a city called Laramie now. In August of 1998, he enrolled in the University of Wyoming, now to be able to work on his true passion. He enrolled in a few different courses, political science and international relations. I think he wanted to go into politics, ultimately. I think that's kind of a given with the courses that he took, but that was the biggest way that he could think that he could make some big changes in the world. And during his time at the University of Wyoming, Matthew Shepard joined the LGBT Students Alliance, and this really gave him a sense of belonging in school. He made so many friends there, he was able to be unapologetically himself, and everyone around him accepted him for exactly who he was. It really seemed that Matthew Shepard was truly happy, or at least finding that happiness for the first time since the incident those years ago in Marrakesh, although this happiness wouldn't last very long. On October 6th, 1998, the now 21-year-old Matthew Shepard went to a meeting with the LGBT Students Alliance, as he did every week, I think it was. And this week, they were specifically planning what they were going to do for Gay Awareness Week, which started the following week. They were planning like a big campaign that was going to go on at the university. And after this meeting, Matthew and all of his friends decided to go to the Fireside Lounge, which was a bar in Laramie. And this bar was known around Laramie for being specifically very accepting and welcoming of the LGBT community. So this was perfect for Matthew and his LGBT Students Alliance group. Because bear in mind, this was the 1990s. Gay marriage was still illegal in most places, and a lot of bars and clubs and general places were still very discriminative. A lot of places just were not safe for people like Matthew and his friends, but not the Fireside Lounge. They made it very clear that they were accepting of anyone and everyone. The group often went there after their meetings if they wanted to celebrate or if they just wanted to socialise for a while, if they'd been planning something big, as they were at this point. So they went to the Fireside Lounge. They all stayed for maybe one drink, but the rest of the group decided that they didn't really want to be there very long and they wanted to go. But Matthew, on the other hand, he didn't want to leave yet. He wanted another drink, and so he told his friends, well, you guys can go if you want, but I'm going to stay here. I'm going to get another drink. And so they decided to leave him there at the Fireside Lounge. His friends didn't have any reason to believe that this would be an issue or that Matthew would be unsafe. I mean, this was a bar that they trusted to go in every single week. However, when Matthew's friends left him at the bar, ordering his second drink that night, that would be the last time that any of them ever saw him. 18 hours later, police received a very frantic phone call from a man named Aaron Kreifels. He'd stumbled across a horrifying scene on his bike ride that morning. Aaron had cycled up to Sherman Hill, which is just outside of Laramie, and it was there where he actually fell off of his bike. And it was as he scrambled to get back to his feet and get on his bike when he looked across the road and he saw what seemed to be a scarecrow slumped against a buck rail fence. But as Aaron got back on his bike and cycled a little bit closer, he realised that this wasn't a scarecrow at all. This was a young man, and this man was absolutely covered in blood from head to toe. It was very clear that this man had been beaten within an inch of his life. His hands had been tied together and behind his back, which had then been tied to this rail so that he couldn't move. And when Aaron found this man, he was unconscious and barely breathing. So Aaron ran off to the nearest house that he could possibly find to borrow their phone and call the police. And then as he made his way back to where the boy was, where he was tied to this fence, Aaron noticed a university ID card on the ground. He bent down and picked up this card, and it was for the University of Wyoming. This was Matthew Shepard. So police and paramedics raced down to this country lane where Matthew was tied to this fence. It was actually a police officer that arrived there first. So this female police officer gets out of her car, rushes over to Matthew and tries to help him in the best way that she can, But of course, this isn't her job. She's a policewoman, not a paramedic. She doesn't really know what to do. She felt his pulse, and Matthew was still alive, but he was barely breathing, so she knew it was only a matter of time. If she didn't do something now, if she didn't help him fast, they could lose him. So this woman is desperately trying to pry his airways open, but his jaw is just clenched shut. She's trying to pull his mouth open or make him breathe somehow, but no amount of her strength could unclench his jaw. This female officer remembers thinking that Matthew, this boy that she's trying to save, was actually a lot younger than he was. Remember, he was 5'2", he was barely 100 pounds. She thought he was a child. He had the stature of a child. And so as she's trying to pry his airways open, she's trying to comfort him. She's saying, "Baby boy, I'm here, kiddo. You're gonna be okay. Hang in there. Don't give up. Come on, you can do this." This woman tried everything she possibly could until eventually paramedics arrived at the scene and they were able to do the job a little bit better. And she remembers as she stood away from Matthew so that the paramedics could get in, she looked at his face and he was just covered in drying blood, apart from 2 thick streaks down his face where his tears had washed away the blood on his face. Matthew was rushed straight to hospital for urgent care, and all the way there in the back of this ambulance, he's in and out of consciousness. They're losing him and then they're getting him back. But when they arrived at this hospital and they finally thought he was going to get treated, the hospital staff started panicking, saying, "I don't think we have the facilities here at this hospital to be able to deal with something so severe." And so Matthew actually had to be transported another 65 miles away to the nearest hospital that did have the facilities to be able to care for a case like this. He arrived at this second hospital just after 9:15 p.m. on October 7th. Matthew was in critical condition as soon as he arrived, and he was put straight onto a life support machine. And it was then, when he was on this life support machine and they could start looking at him and his body and his injuries, that these doctors realised the true extent of what this poor boy had been through over the last 18 hours. There were welts and lacerations all over his body where he'd been beaten and slashed with a blade. They were mainly all over his face and his head, his neck, his chest were the main areas, but they were all over. They were all over his legs, his arms, everything. Matthew had also sustained at least 20 different blows to the head with a very blunt, heavy object. And these had actually been so forceful that it had fractured his skull in 4 different places. Matthew had also suffered a very, very serious injury to the bottom of his brainstem, and if he did end up surviving this ordeal, which I'm going to be honest, it wasn't looking very likely at this point that he would pull through, but if he did, he would be left disabled forever. He would be brain damaged. But despite the severity of his injuries and the importance of operating on him, they really needed to do something. They needed to help him, but they just couldn't. They could not operate on this boy because he did not have the physical strength. If they put him to sleep and started operating on him, he simply just would not wake up. But on top of these physical injuries, it doesn't even stop there. On top of these physical injuries, Matthew was also found to be suffering with hypothermia. He'd been tied to that fence out in the open for 18 hours. And it gets cold in Wyoming. The average temperature in October, which is when this happened, drops as low as -2 degrees Celsius, which is about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. But on top of that, the area where he was found by this fence was also a very windy area, which meant that it would have felt even colder than -2 degrees. Doctors tried everything they could to save Matthew Shepard, but with the amount of injuries and the severity of these injuries as well, they just really couldn't say for sure if it was going to happen or not. They didn't know if they could save this boy. Within just a couple of hours of Matthew being found and transported to hospital, the news of this incident started spreading like wildfire. It was going all over his university. Everyone was just terrified that this kind of thing could happen so close to home. But the people that this news affected the most were, of course, Matthew's friends in the LGBT community. They were worried that had Matthew been attacked just solely based on his sexuality, and if that was the case, then any one of them could be next. Matthew Shepard's parents were actually still in Saudi Arabia at the time of this attack, and so police in Wyoming had the awful task of having to call them on the phone and break the news that their son had been brutally attacked and was barely clinging to life in hospital. His parents were, of course, panicked beyond belief. They ran straight to the airport and got the first flight that they possibly could back over to Wyoming. They arrived back on October 9th, which was 3 days after the attack, 2 days after Matthew had been found and transported to hospital. But when they arrived, they, of course, went straight to the hospital, and when they got inside that hospital room, they looked at their son, and he just didn't even look like their son anymore. He didn't even look like Matthew. His face was swollen beyond belief. There were so many different tubes and wires coming out of him everywhere. It was just like something out of a nightmare. Judy said that the only reason she could tell for sure that that was her son laying there in that hospital bed was because of his dental brace. I actually have a quote here from his mother from when she saw him. She said that there was bandages and stitches all over his face and bandages around his head where the final blow had crushed his brainstem. His fingers and toes were all curled in a comatose position already, tubes enabling his body to stay alive. One of his eyes was partially open so that you could see his blue eyes. You could see his braces, so of course it was Matt. His parents now stayed there at their son's bedside, and they declined to do any interviews with the media at all. By now it was a few days into the case, and this was not only news all over Wyoming, but it was becoming national news. All different American states were hearing of this attack that had taken place, and this boy that was clinging to life in the hospital. And you know what the media can be like. They don't care if a family is grieving. They don't care if a family is losing a loved one. They just want their story. And Matt's family were having none of it. They told hospital staff to turn any and every reporter away. They didn't give any statements or interviews. They just wanted to be there with their son. Understandably. Matthew Shepard spent the next 6 days in hospital in a coma. And it was so tense. I mean, by now the whole nation was hanging by and waiting, hoping that this boy was going to wake up any second. Candlelit vigils were held, prayer circles were held, groups were coming together, different churches. Everyone was banding together because everyone shared that same hope that this boy was going to pull through. They were hoping that it wouldn't be long now until they would get that good news, that Matthew would wake up. But that good news wasn't going to come. Because on October 12th, 1998, Matthew Wayne Shepard was pronounced dead at 12:53 a.m. at the age of 21. Matthew's death shocked the whole country. This was such a kind, wonderful, sweet, caring boy that could have been anyone's son, brother, nephew, cousin, anyone's best friend. And he lost his life in the worst way imaginable. Even President Bill Clinton made several statements about this case in the media, saying that the attackers were full of hatred or full of fear, or both. Clinton also insinuated that whoever had done this to Matthew was too weak to stand up and confess their crimes. He also ended that same statement by saying that Matthew was an inspiration. News of Matthew Shepard's murder affected the LGBT community nationwide. Everyone felt this. This young gay man had been brutally tortured and murdered after spending the night in what was supposed to be an LGBT-friendly bar. It was almost like, well, if we're not safe in a designated safe space like the Fireside Lounge, then where can we be safe? You know, can we be safe anywhere? Does a safe space even exist for the LGBT community? Local LGBT people just stopped going out in general because they were way too scared of where they lived. The Fireside Lounge lost so much business, so many of its patrons, because no one trusted it anymore. No one trusted the bar, no one trusted the people that went there. But anyway, as all of this had been going on, of course Matthew had been in a coma for 6 days before he died, and in that 6 days, police were making some steady progress in this case. So on the first day, they did the initial crime scene search, and this crime scene had so much evidence just everywhere. One of the officers that took part in the search even said, "It's a crime scene like none I've seen in 27 years. There were shoe impressions, tire impressions, blood evidence, and even fibre evidence." You could tell just how savage and prolonged this attack was on Matthew, because there was evidence all over the scene. It wasn't just concentrated in one spot as it normally is. It was like scattered around. Stuff was found up to 50 feet away. Like, this had been a prolonged ordeal that took place in so many different places. It must have been never ending for Matthew. And it was weird because these attackers seem to have made absolutely zero effort to try to cover up what they'd done or cover their tracks. I mean, literal tracks as well. They left footprints and tyre prints and they didn't even try and cover it up. Leading up to and away from the crime scene, there were those tyre prints, so it's clear that they came there in a car and then left in that same car. And there were 3 sets of footprints found at the crime scene. One set of those footprints were identified as Matthew Shepard's own footprints, but the other 2 couldn't be accounted for, which told police that they were looking for 2 people in relation to Matthew's murder. There must have been 2 attackers here. At this point, police also retrieved the rope that Matthew had been tied up with and tied to the fence with, because of course, if his attackers had touched it to be able to tie it up, then it's probably got some sort of DNA evidence or fingerprints, so that was sent off to the lab for testing. But anyway, back at the crime scene, there was blood found in 2 main areas. Of course, the first area was where Matthew was found. It was by that fence. He'd clearly sustained most of his injuries there because there was a lot of blood. It was like pooling on the ground. But then there were also blood drops trailing away from this particular spot by the fence for about 50 feet, and then it trails back again, which was quite interesting to police. It seemed that all of this blood was a match to Matthew Shepard, so it was Matthew that had gone 50 feet away and then come back. And police theorised that he'd actually gotten away from his attackers at one point during this ordeal. Maybe he'd managed to stagger 50 feet down the road and then they caught up with him and then dragged him back down to the fence where the attack ended. And that's probably why Matthew was tied to the fence when he was found, because if he tried to get away once, it makes sense that his attackers would tie him to keep him there. So detectives took all of this information that they derived from the crime scene and they went back to the police station to get to work on this investigation. Meanwhile, other police officers that were out and about on the night that Matthew Shepard was found, or the night that he went missing even, they'd been having one of the busiest nights they'd had in a while. It seemed that a lot was going on in Laramie that night, but one of their biggest call-outs on the same night that Matthew disappeared was to a street fight that was taking place on Laramie's north side. At the time, this street fight seemed just the same as any other. I mean, police were called to a lot of street fights. These were quite common. But officers would soon realise that this street fight and Matthew's attack that both took place on the same night, they were a lot more linked than what initially meets the eye. This street fight was between 2 drug dealers named Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, and those 2 men were fighting another 2 men that were just described as local punks. Henderson and McKinney had been walking down the road when they saw these other 2 men slashing loads of car tyres all up along the road, and Henderson and McKinney had parked their truck a couple of streets away. So they walked over to these 2 local punks and they started telling them off for slashing tyres. Of course, they didn't want it to get to the point where these 2 local punks then went over to their truck and slashed their tyres. So an argument broke out in the middle of the street, and this argument was getting more and more heated until eventually it turned physical. This physical fight went on for quite some time because it seemed that both sides of this fight were quite equally matched in terms of like physical strength, and neither one of them could overpower the other. And the only way that this fight even came to an end was when Henderson, one of the drug dealers, managed to distract one of the other guys while his friend Aaron McKinney pulled out a gun. But McKinney didn't shoot the gun. He actually brought this gun over to this guy who was now had his guard down, he was distracted, and McKinney hit him over the head with the butt of the gun. And this hit from Aaron McKinney was so severe that it actually fractured this guy's skull and he had to be rushed to hospital. When police eventually arrived and saw this street fight, McKinney was also sent to hospital for, I think, some just different injuries that he'd sustained from the fight. Russell Henderson was arrested, but he was later let go that same night, I think. So anyway, police successfully managed to disperse this street fight. Different people were in holding cells, different people were in hospital, and they decided to go and have a look at Henderson and McKinney's truck because they knew that these guys were drug dealers. But when they walked over to this truck and had a look inside, it seemed that drug dealing was the least of their problems now. And that is where I'm gonna end it for part 1. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure you subscribed with notifications on so that you don't miss part 2 when that comes out. Thanks again to Homescapes for sponsoring this video. Remember, there's a link to download the game in the description below, and there's also a handy dandy QR code on screen right now for you to scan. A huge thank you to all of my channel members for supporting me and helping decide the cases that I cover, especially my tier 2 members whose names are all on screen right now. If you want to become a channel member, you can click the link to do so in the description, or you can click the join button if you're on a desktop. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up down below because that would really help me out. I love telling these cases, so if you could support me, that would mean the world. If you want to subscribe to my channel, I post true crime content like this all the time. You can click this link right here. If you want to subscribe to my second channel where I post more lighthearted, dare I say, funny content, click that one there. And if you want to watch another true crime video, I'll pop you a playlist on screen right here if that's what you want. Okay, bye.